Hello my quilting friends! Leah Day here with a new video for the Machine Quilting Block Party. Today we're quilting block number 4, a beautiful daisy Dresden plate block, and we're going to fill it with feathers, circles, and lots of echo quilting. So let's get started learning how to quilt this step by step together. Before we get to quilting, I had a lot of questions when we did our last Dresden plate about clipping away the fabric on the back of the plate. And I'll be honest, this is entirely up to you. And it's one of those things that sometimes I'll do and sometimes I'll skip. So I'm bothering to do it on this one, but I did not clip away the fabric for block number 2, our last Dresden plate that we did together. And this does have a little bit of a risk. You could accidentally cut through the front and accidentally mess up your block. So there is a little bit of risk involved, but the benefit of it is to clip away the extra fabric here and then reduce the bulk of the quilt block itself. So it's entirely up to you. And basically what I'm doing here is I'm just carefully trimming away and using my fingers to make sure that I am only clipping away that beige background fabric here. And it is a little tricky, especially up in these curved petals, because then you'll also end up with the seam allowance, the curved edge of the petal coming in too. So just take your time, work really slowly and steadily, and try not to cut through your block if you decide to do this step. So now it's time for quilting. I've already done a little bit of stitching in the ditch around the center circle, between the petal shapes and around the petals, and in the ditch between the block background and border. And the first design that I'm going to be stitching is right in the center of the quilt. It's some circles that I'm going to quilt with rulers in my ruler foot. Now, if you don't have rulers, don't have a ruler foot, that's just fine. You could always do this just regular free motion quilting. You could mark the circles and then just stitch them with regular free motion quilting. You could also stitch this with your walking foot. It's totally up to you. So I'm pulling up thread here and making sure this circle ring is part of the Dresden plate template set, and I have put some true grips on this so that way it's going to stick and hold nicely on the quilt top. And then I'm just making sure that my foot is lined up here right with the edge of the circle applique. I'm going to make sure I'm getting started on the right foot. Now, circles are pretty tricky to stitch, I have found, because you're kind of hanging onto the circle and you're trying to stay right on that edge. So I'm going to try and talk you through it as we go here. Okay, so I'm just getting started with first few stitches here, and I'm just wanting to make sure that that circle template stays in place, it doesn't move as I quilt around. And so what I'm doing is I'm pushing down on the circle template as I rotate it around the quilt. And it feels a little weird, I'll be completely honest. It's really easy to take some big stitches as you do this, and I just took a couple big ones as I was getting started again, and that's okay. Don't worry about perfection with this. As you swing around, you're just focusing on keeping the edge of that foot pressed up against tightly with that circle template. And you're also trying not to shift the template if you can help it. So I'm back on track here. Slow and steady wins the race. That's really the key, I think. And the benefit of this, you might be wondering, well, this looks really hard. What is the benefit of this? Well, circles are always hard. They're just a tough thing to stitch. And they're a tough shape to quilt. And by quilting it with this ruler as a guide, it makes it just a little bit easier. I've got my thread tails. I'm kind of fiddling with them here so that way I don't make a mess as I stitch back over them. So here I'm going to finish up. I'm going to try and line up with some stitching. I might end up ripping a few stitches here just to make sure that the end and the beginning of that circle line up really nicely, but I'm pretty happy with that. And that's how I'm going to stitch all of the circles in the center of the circle. And it's like, I think 3 different circle shapes. And so I'm going to stitch all of them just the exact same way. So I've stitched the center circle, and there's actually not a ruler that I have that could stitch that. So I did that freehand, and I filled it in with some micro stippling. Now that's not part of the pattern, it's completely optional, but I think it adds a really nice look, and I'm going to show you how to do it in this space between the two rings. We're going to stitch one more ring, and then I'll do some micro stippling. And I wanted to emphasize a few points here. Number one, always drop your needle down when you are ruler foot quilting with the ruler foot in the down position. So make sure to drop it down, bring it back up, and then push the quilt away to bring up that loop of thread. If your foot is in the up position, it can crash against your needle bar and cause some problems. So I just wanted to make sure to emphasize that point. And then this is an alternative way to stitching any circle. You can stitch to the inside with the ruler on the kind of outside, and that's what you're gripping, or you can stitch around the circle this way where the circle template is to the inside of what you're stitching. And I have found this actually, it feels a little easier. So I'll talk you through it here. In this case, I'm pressing down with one hand on the template and kind of pushing the quilt through the machine with the other hand. And I don't know why, but to me this feels a little easier. And what's also nice is once I get done with it, I can remove that template without having to break thread and move on with the design. It's not going to be kind of in my way hanging out on the quilt. So always remember there's multiple ways to stitch any kind of circle, and you just have to play with it to find what works best for you. So I'm swinging around here, and the motion here is I'm pressing down firmly on that template with my hands, with my fingers, and I'm keeping that foot lined up with the edge of that template as I stitch all the way around. And because this method feels easier to me, I'm a lot more accurate with it. So this time I didn't have any kind of weird stitch off, and my stitches weren't messed up right here at the beginning and end. So that's something, kind of food for thought. Anything that feels more natural is obviously going to be easier for you to stitch. Now the micro stippling, you can go into that. It's basically just very tiny, very dense stippling. So start with a more open stippling, maybe on a practice sandwich, and then shrink it down slowly until you can get it on a really small scale. And this is a little tricky to do with your ruler foot because it's a clunkier foot. It's not an open toe. You can't really see the needle. But I wanted to show you this because it is possible to go from using a ruler as a guide to stitching completely freehand with no marks, no ruler, nothing to guide you. Ruler foot quilting is just another form of free motion quilting. The only change is that the foot has a taller base, so that way you can press rulers up against it. So anything that you stitch in regular free motion, you can absolutely stitch with a ruler foot attached to. So I'm going to fill this area in with micro stippling, just wiggling around. I'm just wiggling back and forth, trying not to cross my lines of stitching and trying to keep those lines about 1/8 of an inch apart. Now this is pretty dense, but it's not going to make the whole quilt dense. It's only in this one little section in the center of a block, so I think we're going to be able to get away with it and add a nice punch of texture to the quilt too. One more line that you can quilt with your ruler foot and rulers for a guide is this inner outline between the block and the border. Line up your ruler with the seam line and then just use that as a guide to stitch that straight line, because that straight line is exactly 1/4 inch inside that seam line. It's kind of a little inner border, and I really like this. This is something I've started doing a lot with many different blocks and quilts, and it really just kind of gives a little bit of space off the ditches, and it also stops you from having to do so much travel stitching right in the ditch. So it's really nice. So in this case, I'm pressing the ruler down on the quilt. I am slowly and steadily pushing the quilt through the machine, and I'm making sure that that ruler foot stays pressed up firmly against that ruler and that it's not going to shift off, or I'm not going to wander away from it. I'm going to stay right up against that ruler, and that's going to keep the foot running nice and straight. And it's actually even more accurate than the marks that I've got here on the quilt. I marked this and I was probably not really paying much attention. I'm realizing, that was a little bit off from the ditch lines, but this ruler foot quilting, because it's exactly 1/4 inch from the edges of the ruler foot, it's that much more accurate, and it's going to ensure that I have a really nice inner square for this block. So now I'm working in the center of the block, and I've pulled up thread and started quilting into these petals. And I've already stitched the center stem line of this feather. And so now I'm going to bounce around and quilt the feathers around it. So I'm doing travel back feathers, stitch back, swing out, and form that feather shape. And this time I marked all of the feather designs on the surface of the quilt rather than using paper. I've been getting a lot of feedback from quilters on the Facebook group, and many people are saying the paper is just too tricky to tear away. So I want you to know that it's absolutely possible to mark this. You know, light box is a big investment, but it really does work to help you see through the fabrics, even darker fabrics, so that you can see these designs. I am still including some paper templates so that if you still like marking with paper, you could print those out, put them on top and stitch through them. That works just fine too. So here I'm traveling back and swinging out with the next feather. And notice that I'm kind of keeping a slow, steady pace throughout, especially when I'm travel stitching. Now, as I go into this opposite direction, I'm going to continue to flow in this way, but understand that this is actually the exact opposite of what we've just been doing. We've been kind of branching up and out. Now we're branching out and down and then kind of curling in. It's the opposite motion. And if you find half of your feathers don't look very good, pay attention to that and focus on it, because this angle, this direction, for some reason does not feel natural to me. And I always find it a bit of a struggle to quilt feathers in this way. So always pay attention to that. Pay attention to those little nuances, because that really can start to illuminate and help your quilting make sense and really pinpoint for you which directions feel natural to you, and just stitch in those directions. You know, you can absolutely travel stitch and quilt both sides of the feather the exact same way. So in this case, if I wanted this to feel better, I would have travel stitched down the feather and brought all of the side back up to the top and then travel stitch back down again. You know, it's a small thing, but sometimes that can make a really big difference in how something feels to quilt. And of course, if it feels more natural, then it's probably going to look more natural, and it's going to feel easier to do. So now I'm going to use this edge of the circle. I'm travel stitched, and I've stitched this in the ditch, so it's nice and secure. Can travel stitch right on top of that stitching and reach the next petal. And this is just a simple arch shape. Very, very speedy quilting. And you could mark this with a stencil, or you could easily mark it with a light box, or you could freehand quilt it. It's totally up to you. I like little shapes like this because they're very, very simple, and you know, they really add to the design. In this case, we have a very complex feather in half of the leaves of this Dresden plate, and then we have a very simple design in these blue feathers, in these blue petals, I should say. I got feathers on the mind. All right, so that's how I'm going to quilt these two sets of shapes. I'm just going to continue travel stitching around this circle and then quilting into the next design. Very, very simple quilting. Just remember, slow and steady wins the race. Actually, it's not a race. Just stitch slow and steady, and all of these designs will come together really easily. The next part of this block to stitch is the background, and this is a series of bouncy echoes. So I'm starting over here. I just travel stitched out between two petals, and I'm getting started. You're going to use this inner outline that we've already stitched as something to travel stitch along. So now I'm going to come down and I'm going to bounce. I'm going to just hit that space where the two petals come together, and then I'm going to stitch out and bounce around the next one. Very, very simple stitching. And notice that I am stitching this in a clockwise direction. I always find that that feels easier whenever I have a block moving in a clockwise direction, because it's like less of the quilt is in the arm of the machine at any given time. So now I'm stitching around, and I'm going to bounce against these petals, and I'm just going to work my way all the way around the quilt and continue to bounce. And you can see that's how this is built. I'm going to just bounce back and forth into one corner so that way I can show you how it builds up on the quilt. What you're going to do is continue bouncing into the same spaces, and that's how this is going to build up thread and really look pretty in the background of the block. I call these bouncy echoes. You know, a regular echo is like this echo shell in the border where you travel stitch in the ditch or along a line of quilting. With these bouncy echoes, we're going to do a little bit of travel stitching to space out, but for the most part, they're going to bounce against one another, just touch, and then stitch back in the opposite direction. And they're always, because they touch in that spot, they're always going to build up thread a little bit there. It's going to look really cool. So you can knock out one corner at a time if that's more comfortable for you, or you can stitch clockwise around the whole block. Here I'm bouncing around for the third row. And you know, when you're stitching out this nice smooth curve, put your foot down. If your hands are moving nice and fast, go on ahead and speed up the speed of your machine. Just always make sure to stitch down into that area. You're going to build up thread there. It might not be super noticeable if you're matching, and if you're stitching in white thread like I am, it might be super noticeable in the block. But as you build up more and more layers, it's going to look really pretty. So that's how you knock out the background with these bouncy echoes. And now the last part of the block is our echo rainbows, our little rainbows here in the border. We're going to stitch that nice arch shape and travel stitch carefully. Notice how I slow down the machine so that way I can travel stitch without hopping out of the ditch or losing control. I'm going to stitch that next arch shape and travel stitch over. And you could also quilt this from the inside to the outside. I personally like it from the outside in. I don't know why, it just feels more natural to me, but play around with it and see what feels the most natural for you. Now I'm going to travel stitch over to that corner and then fill in that little corner spiral. And this is the same design that we've had in all of the blocks. And you know, it's one of those things I just really wanted to help you build skill for echo quilting. It is tricky and it does take time. So I'm kind of giving you a nice space where you can really see your skill getting built every single month. So you can look back at block number 1 and then compare it to block number 12 when we get to it, and I'm sure you're going to see a real improvement in your skills. Now I fill up that spiral with I fill in that circle with the spiral, and now I'm travel stitching all the way back out again. And you know, if you have a wobble or a wiggle in your stitching or something doesn't look quite right, just throw a little bit more thread at it. You know, stitch back over it a few more times and it'll look great. And here is our finished Daisy Dresden quilt block. So that's it for this video. I really hope that you enjoyed learning how to quilt this Daisy Dresden block. You can find this quilt pattern at leahday.com/blockparty. If you have any questions about this quilting process, definitely ask in the comments below. I really want to help you master machine quilting this year. If you enjoyed this video, please share it with your friends and subscribe to my channel on YouTube so you don't miss out on the next quilting video coming out soon. Until next time, let's go quilt!